So looking beyond Governor's Island over here, a little past that area, that is Brooklyn, ladies and gentlemen. And this was an important rival city to New York City. It was a separate city then, at the time around the Revolutionary War, and it had 20,000 people, which actually I shouldn't say only. That was the second largest city in the colonies, next to Philadelphia. So it was very important. And George Washington, at the time, he'd been in New York for 3 months. He knew this was an important spot to be in, but he also knew that over there in Brooklyn was extremely important as well. At the time, on that hill over there, known as Brooklyn Heights, there were 7 or 8 houses and a church, but he knew full well the British were on the way, and there was going to be a fight right in New York because they wanted to split the North and the South of the Patriots' troops and thereby more or less win the war. Let's dial it back to a siege that happened in Boston with the Patriots and the English fighting there. Now, Washington knew at that point there was a hill, and if he had that hill, he could fend off the British, and he was successful in doing so. If the British had that hill over there, they could launch artillery shells right into Manhattan and ground this place to dust, and he was not going to allow that to happen. He only had 13,000 raw, untrained Patriot troops. They had been fighting for a year, ladies and gentlemen. The war was on, but America was not a country yet. But he knew that he had to have that spot, so he split his troops, and he ended up being on that side eventually when the battle begins. And this is the Battle of Brooklyn. Many people consider this to be the most important battle of war, and really it is for many reasons. I'm going to go into it. As far as what was going on with the colonies at that time, well, we were forging a new government. And what did that look like? Well, they were in Philadelphia hammering out something, a piece of paper called the Declaration of Independence. Right about that time, the English came into Manhattan's harbor with a huge sea of ships, 34,000 of them all told, and landed over on Staten Island, right that direction, that island over there. They were also, at that time, oblivious to the fact that this document had been found out. What date was that, ladies and gentlemen? July, 1776? No, it was July 2nd. It was made public on the 4th. And from 4 days beyond that point, the news reached New York, and there was huge jubilation all around, because finally, the colonists were no longer fighting just for their land and property and their lives. They were fighting for an ideal of a new nation who we hadn't seen on this globe before, one that hard to the new ideas of enlightenment and freedom. There was a huge excitement around it, and Washington knew that this was such a strategic point. He had to do something about it and hold it. So he went over there with his troops, left the others here but with the commander that was here, and waited for the British to come. Well, he waited and waited. To the horror of all the colonists, they brought more ships and more ships. Finally, 35,000 ships, 35,000 troops strong, with these 400 ships. It's just a whole sea of ships out there. And then, from his scouts in Jersey, Washington gets the news. The British are starting to move. Just that evening, huge clouds rolled into Manhattan, and an ominous storm begins, an electrical one, that zapped down lightning bolts and destroyed homes just like that in fires, killing people indiscriminately here and there. It raged for 3 hours, an almost supernatural hold over Manhattan. Finally, it lifted. It said that the mass metal of all the armies here caused it to attract. But 3 hours going into it, after this constant loud thunder, it goes away. And right before dawn comes along, you hear another thunder, the beating of the English drums. They have begun by taking 4,000 troops on ships and bringing them over 3 miles over to Long Island. A loyalist, a traitor to us, showed them a passageway that was narrow, and they came through that, and then they attacked a lower defense works around that strategic point that Washington had created. They destroyed that, and they set in for a siege. Washington was concerned. He had deep concerns. There were 35,000 of them, and only 13,000 of his own troops. And he realized that if they lost the battle, it would be the end of the war. So instead of fighting them, he thought it was better to leave and fight another day and retreat. And this is exactly what he did. But how? If the British caught him as he was trying to leave, if they could easily pulverize the army and take him as captive, and the whole war would have been finished. So he very intelligently created a trick where he left the campfires burning that night, and he forbade anyone to even speak a word, even a whisper. He did whatever he could to silence everything. He told all the men to muffle the cannon wheels with rags to keep them silent. And they proceeded on. It took longer than expected because the cannons got stuck in the mud. And right as dawn was coming up, and they could possibly be seen by the British, a thick pea soup fog came along. You couldn't see 6 feet in front of you. And years later, people would say this was a hand of God or fate, causing George Washington to create his victory of a retreat, which he did. He was the last man on that ship. And he sailed back into the island of Manhattan and went up into the northern part of it for safety. Now, things continued. This is said, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, to be the greatest U.S. military maneuver in history. And it was the first one, too, because we were just a brand new country, the first fight. We lost hardly a man on that in defending this area, and we lived to fight another day, especially George Washington to boldly do this. But let me just point one other thing out that's very important. Lord Howe approached a congressional group and offered an offer on a date, again, you may think is interesting. September 11th, 1776. He went over to this group and he said, look, if you renounce the Declaration of Independence, we'll forget about this and it'll all be business as usual. And they said, never! We're going to fight on. From that time on, George Washington took his troops and headed up north and to safety to slowly build his forces. And he had important skirmishes and fights throughout. He wore the British out. And then finally in 1783, on Evacuation Day, they hightailed it out of here.